Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into the warning that nobody listened to. Let's get started. For any of our listeners who listened to the last few episodes, you might remember that I had mentioned in one of our episodes the fact that the media is telling you a lot of lies about what's going on in the Middle East. And I think that it's my duty to talk to you a little bit more about what you might not be hearing. I pointed out how on one side you will see a lot of people who support the government, US or Israeli, no matter what. Complete support with no criticism whatsoever. If you believe in what the government is doing, they could do no wrong. On the other side, and truthfully the one that bothers me a little bit more, is the side that wants to see Israel and the United States fail. And this past week I've been watching plenty of news on both sides of the argument, but watching the left media take every opportunity to suggest that this is a complete and utter failure is unbelievable. It's not the truth. Sure, are there things that could be criticized on both sides? Absolutely. But the way that they're portraying the current situation as total and utter failure in all aspects of this war is disingenuous and flat out a lie. It's almost like what I said in a previous episode. It kind of seems like they are hoping the US and Israel will fail, and they are trying to present that case. If they can suggest that Israel and the United States are both failing, then clearly it means that Israel is terrible and the United States government currently, which they don't support, is also terrible, because all of this is a failure. One of the things that I had mentioned in the previous podcast episode was how the world is ignoring the entire issue of the Persian and Iranian people. When you try and paint this entire thing as a complete failure, you kind of have to ignore the fact that the Persian people and the Iranian people want to and deserve to be free from their oppressors. And sometimes you'll hear this mentioned very briefly, followed by but, and a whole bunch of reasons why either it's not worth it, or it's too dangerous, or why this isn't our war. There's always reasons why we ignore the fact that there are successes, especially when it comes to hopefully freeing the Iranian people, not to mention security for the rest of the world. I have to be honest, it is pretty disgusting to watch these media sources bend over backwards to try to present everything as a negative. Whether they are taking apart every possible strike that they're going to criticize, why did they hit this, how did they hit that, how much it costs per bomb, what it's doing to the economy, or the Straits of Hormuz being closed by the Iranians, and how that affects your gas prices. I get that these things are very important, don't get me wrong. We are all feeling it. But the fact that they are trying to suggest these as somehow more important than the other objectives is just simply being disingenuous. At least paint the entire story correctly. Is it worth paying 10 cents more a liter, or however much per gallon, to allow these people to be free, or to ensure that the world is a safer place? We are getting kind of soft. We as the world are getting very uncomfortable with war, which is understandable. War is not great. But we used to in the past understand that it was unfortunately sometimes required when you're dealing with evil people who threaten the entire world. And it's no surprise, really, that the world has kind of turned against the idea of war. We have the UN, which is supposed to be this wonderful, peaceful place where all the countries get together and no war ever happens because we can just talk things through. How well has that gone? But also, we've had a history, unfortunately, in the last number of years, where wars turn out to be very stupid things to do when you're not doing it for the right reason. I can totally understand why people are very weary about war. But I hate to break it to very Western, comfortable people. Sometimes war is a necessity. Sometimes war has to happen to protect yourself, your people, or even in some cases, other people across the world. As an example of what I would consider a justified going to war or conflict for the betterment of other people is something like Kosovo. Kosovo, where the NATO countries decided that they were no longer going to accept mass ethnic cleansing of Albanians by a terrible dictator. I think it's fair to say that that is a justified reason to go to war, to protect the lives of people who could have been murdered by a genocidal dictator. This, to the Western world, used to seem like something that was valid and a good reason to go to war or military conflict in order to save the lives of those people who were in need. Fun fact, and a side note, the United Nations voted against this action in Kosovo because the Russians and the Chinese, two permanent members of the Security Council, did not want to set a precedent that you are allowed to go in and protect people in a foreign country. The United Nations hard at work stopping wars, right? But back to today and what's going on in Iran, who murdered anywhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people, their own people in their own country. That's apparently not worth going to war for? We have really become very soft and either decided let the world kill each other and it's not our problem, or we are not willing to actually put our money where our mouth is in order to protect people who are in need. I hate to say we're getting a little selfish. However, I will acknowledge the fact that unfortunately, due to very big mismanagement by various governments, especially the United States when it came to Afghanistan and Iraq, unfortunately it seems like we've gotten into the habit of going to war for maybe the wrong reasons, or even worse, not actually following through with the war because the public pressure becomes a little too much. Whether it's internal politics of one's country, or even worse, the stupid United Nations, which has been pretty much useless, the pressure on countries who do go to war, even for valid reasons, are often forced to just go into a ceasefire, ignore the win or loss of the war, and just agree to disagree and continue doing the things you're doing, leaving the thing unfinished. This seems to be the new way that wars are conducted, especially when you look at Israel, where constantly every country is telling Israel to stop, just short of getting rid of their enemies, so we can do it all again in 10 years. So this is the world that we're living in now. The ceasefire world. The who cares about other people world. And that's why we see many countries around the world ignoring or even calling out the Americans and the Israelis for taking on a horrible, oppressive regime that not only kills its own people, but threatens the entire world. It's kind of sad when you think about it, how many people in Europe just don't really care. So what that Israel's being bombed constantly? So what that there's been a terror proxy network surrounding this country for years, shooting rockets, kidnapping their people, killing their people? It's fine. It doesn't bother us. It's not our problem. This is the way that Europe, and America in some cases, think. And for fun, we can put in Canada and Australia too, because they love to follow what the Europeans are doing. If they are anti-war, we are now anti-war. If they recognize a fake place called Palestine, we're going to recognize a fake place called Palestine. All of these countries get to sit back, watch Israel do what it needs to do to defend itself, while they judge from afar, from the safety of their own homes. However, this week has been a little bit of a game changer. In a previous episode, we'd spoken about the fact that Iran has now technically tried to shoot rockets and missiles at Europe. They shot at Cyprus, and they shot into Turkey. The war was possibly going to come to Europe. And despite that, the European powers were kind of indifferent about the whole thing. They didn't really care all that much. We're safe over here. I'm in France. I'm in Germany. It doesn't really affect us. Unfortunately for them, once the British decided to allow the Americans to use their joint base, Diego Garcia, off the coast of India, that made them a new target for Iran. So Iran decided to shoot a missile from its own land at Diego Garcia, roughly 4,000 kilometers away. And the fact that they almost hit it with two different missiles was a proof and a sign to the Europeans that we could hit that far, despite the fact that they thought they were so comfortable for so many years, and despite the fact that Israel had been warning these countries that you are being targeted. They are making a missile program in order to hit Europe. And the Europeans said nothing. They didn't care. But now that they've seen it with their own eyes, this is definitely a game changer. And many of these European countries are now freaking out because they have no defense systems. If you think about what we talked about on our previous podcast, about how the Arab world is getting hit really hard, it's because they really don't have the same defense that Israel has. And the Europeans have even less. They never expected that this would be a thing. They ignored every warning that Israel was saying, that they're going to come after the West, and you're next. And now, it's a little too late. You're watching it with your own eyes. They can hit mainland Europe with their missiles. Hate to be the person to say this, but we told you so. And now they are forced to actually enter this conflict. They didn't want to. They wanted to avoid conflict because they said it wasn't worth it. But now that they are a target, all of a sudden they want to get involved. According to reports, countries like Canada, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and even Japan, among many others, have agreed to help the Americans with the Straits of Hormuz for economic reasons, but also now realizing that they are also targets to this evil regime, and they can't just sit back and pretend it doesn't affect them, economically or physically their safety. Some other reports, places like South Korea, Australia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and many others are also joining the fight to open up the Straits of Hormuz. All of these countries who at first came out very against this whole operation, saying they didn't want to attack Iran, now are realizing that they need to get involved. The way that I see it, or even the way they see it possibly, is that in order to ensure the safety of Europe, who is now defenseless against these missiles that we know can hit them, they need to ensure that the Iranian regime is taken out, either the regime itself or at least their missile capabilities. So what's the best way that they can help, maybe without direct impact on Iran? It would be opening the Straits of Hormuz to allow the economy to continue and allow the Americans and the Israelis to continue taking out the actual regime. And this might be why we are seeing the world finally admit maybe we should get involved. Maybe this is a worthwhile cause. And I hate to point out, maybe also a concern that they wanted nuclear weapons. Now that you know they have missiles that can actually reach your country, maybe you want them to stop making those missiles and definitely never get a nuke. As I said earlier, I understand why so many people are adverse to the idea of a war. It's terrible, and people are already seeing the effects right now. It has been a very long time, generations, that we've seen countries go to war to the point where it affects the economy. But if you really think back to one of the most important wars of our time, World War II, could you imagine this same thing happening back then? It was a very different time and a very different understanding of what goes on in war. During World War II, there was terrible economic issues. There was massive government debt in order to build what they needed for these wars, high taxes and war bonds that were being sold in order to fund whatever they could, shortages and rationing, things like gasoline and meat and sugar. People were restricted from buying everyday goods because they couldn't afford it or there wasn't enough to go around. And not to mention, of course, inflation whenever a war happens. But can you imagine using these excuses to not have gone to World War II in order to save millions of Jewish lives, as well as Europeans and many other people who are living under Nazi oppression? Can you imagine saying it's not worth a couple extra dollars for gas? Although there was an anti-war movement, unfortunately for them, it wasn't a very strong one, and history proved them to be wrong. But majority of people understood that it would cost them a little bit of luxury, a little bit of hardship, in order to do what was right, which was get rid of the Nazis. And at the time, I am sure there were people who wanted some type of agreement or ceasefire or whatever. Let's just end the war kind of halfway. The Nazis will promise not to do certain things or not to attack us specifically, and then it'll be fine. We'll just call it a day. Can you imagine if you would have left the Nazis in charge and trusted them to not continue to take over the world or kill Jews? It would be an absolutely ridiculous idea. That doesn't happen in real war, where you agree to let the dictator continue to do what they're doing, with a promise. And for any of my history buffs who might be listening to this, you might be screaming into your speakers right now, saying, wait a minute, didn't the British do exactly that? And the answer is yes. Under Chamberlain, he has that iconic film coming back from Germany with his piece of paper that Hitler signed saying, we will not attack the British. There will be no world war. As long as you give me X and Y, we'll be good. How did that turn out? Not too well, I don't think. So this modern day suggestion that trying to make a deal or a ceasefire or just get someone to agree to be a good boy from now on is going to be enough is just wishful thinking. I hate to say it's as stupid as the United Nations, thinking you can just talk about your problems and there'll be no more war. It's a fantasy. Sometimes war is necessary. War is required to get rid of people who don't want peace. The only way that World War II ended was with the total collapse of the Nazi ideology, was them being kicked to the ground so hard that they realized that their entire ideology was completely worthless. It was a failure. Unconditional surrender is the only way to teach these people a lesson. And we've learned that, sadly, the hard way, when we look at the Middle East. Because all of the conflicts we've seen, especially in places like Gaza, where you go to ceasefires every 5 years, only brings Hamas back for another round 5 years later. The ideology continues. Because to them, if they have not been humiliated to the point where their movement dies, then they will just come back and call it a victory, which again, we've seen in Gaza many times. If even one Hamas member is left alive, they call it a significant win. No matter how many supposed civilians die, no matter what Gaza looks like, they don't care. It's a win because they can always rebuild. We could not make this mistake again when it comes to Iran. We could not try and make a deal with whoever's left alive in Iran that will call this a win, will continue to rebuild and oppress their people, and threaten the world in 10 or 15 years from now, if not sooner. We have to look at this kind of like the Marshall Plan in World War II. Again, imagine World War II had we not done the Marshall Plan, which had the sole aim to try and take Germany, realign it to be a democracy, a place of peace, and a place of cooperation, free of Nazi ideology. It wasn't easy, it took a long time, and it took even more money. And yet, look at Germany today. It is possible if you are willing to destroy the ideology and not quit halfway through. If you want some more information on that issue, de-radicalization, we did a great episode on Gaza and de-radicalization in Season 3, Episode 99, if you want to go check that out after. In the end, what really bothers me is the way that we are trying to use this modern day idea of UN, peace-loving, all of these nations are equal and we can just all get along. And the only people that are starting wars are the people who are warmongers and just want to take over countries, when that is completely untrue, no matter what you will see sometimes in the media and on social media. The reality is sometimes we do need to go to war. There are valid and good reasons to save human lives, to protect the people who cannot protect themselves, or even to stop a genocidal leader who has aims to kill everybody else in the world. Those are valid reasons to go to war. And we as a society, unfortunately, have forgotten that. It has been so long. We are so spoiled in the West now, free of wars, thank God. For some reason, we are so against the idea of doing what is right, if it even costs us an extra nickel on gas. And for places like Europe, who have been free of war for quite some time and have avoided it, thankfully, for so many years, they are so against the idea of going to war that unless it's going to affect them personally, and it's proven to them, they really are trying to avoid it at all costs. Even if, in the end, they end up getting dragged into a war. They can only put their head in the sand for so long before the reality catches up to them. Gone are the days where the world, or at least the Western world, had moral clarity. What was good and what was evil? What caused a threat to the world and what didn't? But unfortunately, we seem to have lost that ability to see right and wrong. And we just pray and hope that places like the United Nations will just fix it magically. But sadly, that's not how this works. Unfortunately, you have a group of people who are hell-bent on killing their own people and killing the rest of the world for their own ideological needs, just like the Nazis. And you can try your best to ignore the warnings, and you can try and pull a Chamberlain and come back with your piece of paper and say that the Iranians have decided that they are no longer going to bother the rest of the world, they do not want to get nukes anymore, and their missile technology will stop right where it is, where it can only hit Europe. But who's going to believe them? Why should we believe them? They are currently like a caged animal in the final death spiral, aimlessly shooting rockets and missiles at all of the countries around the world, just in order to try and save themselves. These are the people we're going to trust? For many years, the West has been ignoring the warning signs. Israel has been saying that the West is next, and they've ignored it. And now, unfortunately, the West is now. The West can be hit by these missiles. And what they choose to do with that warning, I guess only time will tell. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.